Welcome to the 7th episode of our weekly Al-Monitor webinar series on the Israel-Hamas war and its impact on the region. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of Al-Monitor. Our guests today are Al-Monitor Chief Correspondent Amberin Zaman and Fabrice Balanche, an Adjunct Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Both of them recently returned from Syria and Iraq, where they were doing reporting and research on developments there. A reminder to our viewers to please send your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. Welcome to you both. Amberin, I'd like to start with you. In your interview this past week, or while you were in Syria with SDF Commander Mazloum Kobani, you asked him about the SDF position on the Israel-Hamas war. Tell us about that position, how the war may be influencing and impacting the situation in Syria. And if you could contrast it, you're also in the Kurdistan region of Iraq prior, with comments made there by a number of Kurdish and Iraqi officials about the war. There seems to be mixed reactions and differing impacts in how the war is playing out.
Well, it's great to be on this program with you, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me. I would say that General Mazloum Kobani, everybody calls him General Mazloum out there, the commander-in-chief of the Syrian Democratic Forces, his response I found to be extremely nuanced and very savvy. First of all, he made it very clear that he was totally opposed to what Hamas had done, that any attack against any civilian was absolutely unacceptable and totally in contradiction with their own philosophy, which was one of self-defense, but never attacking unprovoked. And that was, of course, a sort of oblique swipe at the Turks, who keep attacking them unprovoked. He did say very clearly that the Kurds stand with the Palestinian people, that he'd sent a message to Mahmoud Abbas, so then again making his position clear that that's the side, they have dialogue with, absolutely not the other side, not Hamas. And that he'd sent a message to him saying that they, were standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. But the broader point he made, the very important point he made, was, first of all, of course, that the two nations, the Palestinians and the Kurds, for as long as their demands remain unaddressed, for as long as there's no just and sustainable solution to the Kurdish and Palestinian problems, there will be no stability in the Middle East. At the same time, he made it very clear that, Israel's actions, after having very roundly, expressly condemned what Hamas did, that Israel's use of disproportionate force was in fact triggering a new cycle of extremist violence, very likely to do that, to spur the creation of new extremist violent groups who would legitimize, their existence through what Israel was doing to Palestinians in Gaza, and pointing out that, these problems, be they the Kurdish problem or the Palestinian problem, need ultimately to be addressed through, mediation, politics, a dialogue. So using that opportunity to remind the world that that's what's required in both cases. Coming to the KRG and Iraq, it was very interesting to see the different takes on this issue when I was in Dahuk, in fact, with Fabrice at the AUK annual seminar, whatever, meeting, conference, where you had actually some heavy hitters, including Fuad Hussein, the foreign minister and deputy prime minister of Iraq, who was quite clear about, how the Iraqi government is totally opposed to the actions of Israel. As you all know, Iraq does not recognize Israel, and in fact has passed legislation criminalizing any kind of contact between Iraqi citizens and Israel. So that's a pretty hawkish stand. And, you know, for that reason, they don't even talk about a two-state solution. They talk about the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. So that's where he stood, and reflecting broadly the Iraqi government position. And then you had the Prime Minister of the KRG, Masroor Barzani, sort of trying to tread a very sort of, you know, trying to keep his head down, trying not to, you know, say very much at all about all of that, because the Kurds find themselves in a bind, because on the one hand, obviously, Iran is a very influential actor in Iraq and has, you know, quite a bit of leverage over Baghdad and indeed over the Kurds, just by virtue of geography and their ability to attack the Iraqi Kurds when they feel like doing it, which they have done. And so they have to, you know, avoid provoking them. On the other hand, of course, the West is terribly important to the Iraqi Kurds. And there is that traditional sympathy that exists between, in particular, the Barzani family and Israel, though they don't like that to be articulated very much. But, you know, this sort of common cause against Arab oppressors, as it's articulated. So he was sort of trying to, you know, not say very much about it at all. But interestingly, the president of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, his cousin Nechirvan Barzani, was more, I think, forthcoming on the issue, and making actually some of the very same points that Mazloum made about how disproportionate force is very unhelpful, and calling for a two-state solution.
Fabrice, let me turn to you. Israel has resumed its military operations on Hamas in Gaza today. Iranian proxy forces in Syria and Iraq have seemed to escalate based upon the course of the conflict. We've seen a great uptick in attacks on U.S. forces and positions in Syria and Iraq since October 7th. Tell us a little about how you see the Iranian role in both Iraqi and Syrian Kurdistan, and how you see, and even more broadly, and how you see this playing out with the war resuming.
Well, first, I think that Iran don't want a direct confrontation with Israel from Lebanon and from Syria, because they know that the reaction will be terrible for the both country, and so they want to avoid this temptation. But Iran is taking the opportunity to try to expel the American troops from Syria and Iraq. That's why we have seen harassment with rockets, with drones in Syria against the military base, in Iraq too, because the goal is to increase the level of risk for the soldier American soldier in Iraq and in Syria. We are in the US, we start the electoral campaign for the presidential, and we know that the year of the election, US are weak outside, because of course the domestic policy is much more important for the president. If you have a success abroad, you will not get vote more, but if you have a defeat outside, we lose vote. So Iranians know that very well, and they are trying to do what they can to make insecure the presence of the American troops, and it will continue. It will continue all the year. It's not a new process. We have seen before the Gaza attacks, the temptation to strike, not just temptation, they are strike the American troops in Syria. It started in September when you have the uprising in the Azov, and also when you had anti-Kurdish demonstration in Kirkuk. It was clear that you had the Iranian behind, the Syrian regime, of course, and Baghdad for Iraq, because Iraq want to reduce the freedom of the Kurdistan region, and the regime want to get back the Syrian Kurdistan, because course, for territorial region, but also because it's you have the oil and it's the breadbasket of the country. So also they are using proxies like the Shabak in Mosul area, Arab tribe in Syria, to try to destabilize the both Kurdistan. And Baghdad has also the strong economic leverage because since March 2023, Kurdistan cannot export anymore its oil through Turkey, and Baghdad don't give the share of the budget, don't transfer any money to Kurdistan to pay the salaries of the civil servant and to pay the investment. So this is the trend that we have seen for a long time already. But with Gaza, it's accelerating because the Iranians want to take the opportunities to expel the American troops.
Amberin, you are a frequent traveler to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. You know the leadership there, the people there. How is the KRG managing the recent developments in the country? And here I'm talking about the complicated negotiations over the oil law, the complicated negotiations over the budget law, the pressure from Iran, which has been pretty pronounced, and probably most complicating for the KRG, the divisions between the PUK and the KDP.
Well, all of those issues, of course, are very much in play. And of course, the most immediate one is the oil, because the oil is hugely important to the KRG because it's used to finance the salaries of their public, sector. It's vital. And since March, that oil has not been flowing. And initially, of course, the consensus was that Turkey stopped the flow. And we all knew that what Turkey was basically telling Baghdad was that unless you sort of scrap this fine that was imposed on us by the International Court in Paris, arbitration court, because as we know, Iraq went to arbitration because it was basically arguing that Turkey and the Kurds were selling Iraqi oil illegally, and the court ruled in their favor. And so Turkey wanted the fine. It was 1 billion something waived, and also for Iraq to drop a pending arbitration case that covers revenue from between 2018 running till March when the pipeline was turned off. But then more recently, of course, in public, Turkey was saying, oh, the earthquake damaged the line. We need to do some technical stuff. That was the official reason that was put forward. But now Turkey is saying, hey, we're ready. We can, we're good to go. We can just turn on the taps again. But there, Iraq and Baghdad and the KRG seem unable to sort this out. And when I spoke to the foreign minister, Fuad Hussein, like 10 days ago or whenever it was, he did sound optimistic, but then he has to, right? He basically said that what was standing in the way was the sort of their differences over how to handle contracts with the IOCs. My understanding is that Baghdad would like to scrap all the existing contracts between the KRG and the IOCs and have them, negotiated, from scratch with Baghdad. So what the broader pattern here is one of Baghdad trying to regain full control, I would say, over the KRG, be it through the oil, which, as I said, is critical, but through legislation, saying it doesn't recognize the sort of laws that were passed by the KRG parliament, a whole array of such things, what's happening in Kirkuk, where again, you see an Arabization in play and the Kurds once again sort of under tremendous pressure. So, on the one hand, that you have that in play, at the same time, as you mentioned, there are these problems between the KDP and the PUK, just the perennial problems that seem to be getting I would say they're not improving. You know, you had that show of unity at this conference where you had the Talabani brothers, Bafel and Kubad, and the Barzani cousins, Nichirvan and Masroor, all sitting together. But, you know, it's very clear that those tensions are very real. They still are very deep. And what's changed is, you know, when in the past it was just between the two parties, it's now within the two parties as well, where you have tensions between the various family members as well, and the whole succession issue. It's less pronounced, I would say, in the PUK, because Bafel and Kubad seem to get on quite well. You know, Bafel is in charge and Kubad seems to be accepting of that. And Lahore Talabani, you know, was sidelined. He's trying to make some kind of comeback, saying he will run in these elections. And so the other sort of issue is the elections. What will happen with the elections? And the PUK is trying to push them back again. They were meant to be held in November. They're now set to be held in February, but the PUK just doesn't feel confident that it will do well. It feels very threatened, in particular, by a new generation. And they even have asked for the elections inside the teachers' union to be postponed, because even there they don't feel confident. So it's that dysfunction continues. And of course, the other issues is that of the unity between unifying the Peshmerga. They don't seem to be going very far with that, even though the Peshmerga minister has finally, the PUK, provides that minister, has returned to his job. And then there's a whole other dimension with Turkey, of course, which you may want to talk about as well, going forward.
Thank you, Fabrice. Let's talk a little about the internal situation in Syria recently. How do you see the position of Assad and his government? Is it strengthened because of the war and what's happening? And this is related to a question we just got. You had mentioned earlier the Sueda uprising. How serious is that, and do we expect that to spread?
Yes, Assad is strengthened. He's not weaker as we thought, as we think in the West. You have a uprising in Sweden. It's not an uprising, it's demonstration, peaceful demonstration, and just from the city, from the middle class of Sweden. And we haven't seen any solidarity in the rest of Syria. In Daraa or in the Alawite area, people don't demonstrate. First, because people are very tired about the war, but they want to know it's just a peace, security. Okay, they would like to have electricity, because we cannot live very good with just 1-2 hours of electricity per day. The salaries are very low, $20 a month, and life is expensive in Syria because many things now are imported because we have no more industry in Syria, or the agriculture has been damaged by the war. So only the people who have somebody outside who send them money can survive. The other people, unfortunately, are starved. But people are so busy to look for food, to look for gas, to look for fuel for the generator, that they don't want to make politics anymore. They have seen the result of 12 years of civil war. Many people have the nostalgia of before the Arab Spring. And many people told me, if we know that will be the result of this uprising, we never demonstrate against the regime. So be careful about what's happening in Sweden. It's not a real vision what's happened in Syria. But the regime, of course, is not so strong. It will never be like before 2011. That has been a very centralized regime. Outside Damascus, he has a very light control. For instance, in Sweden, it's Druze militia who are in charge of the area. Same thing in Aleppo, in Latakia. No, Assad, okay, is a president, but you have a kind of indirect control of the country through warlords who are now in charge of the security, who are racketing, who are cleaning their money in real estate, etc. And this is the new reality of Syria. But of course, he has the support of Iran and Russia. We have seen in September when Turkish proxies tried to take Manbij, you had the Russian strike on them to prevent them to take Manbij from the Syrian Democratic Forces. But does it mean the Russians still want status quo in Syria? We don't want to let Turkish proxies or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib to take advantage of the relative weakness of the regime.
Thank you. And a reminder for our viewers to send questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. Amberin, a question for you. General Kobani, in his interview with you, said that there seems to be, if I'm recalling correctly, and if our viewers recalling correctly, there seems to be no movement in terms of the negotiations between the SDF and the Syrian government. If you could provide an update on the state of play between the Syrian Kurds, the Syrian government, and Turkey, and do we see any progress toward that conflict being resolved?
Well, before I respond to that question, I would just very quickly want to add to my previous comments about Iraqi Kurdistan that, of course, there's a huge economic problem with, they can't pay the salaries, public sector salaries. They're like 3 months behind. There's huge popular discontent in Iraqi Kurdistan. So to get back to Syria and what's happening with the regime, well, absolutely nothing. Because Assad feels absolutely no need to talk to the Syrian Kurds about anything. I mean, short of, you're happy to capitulate. If you're ready to capitulate and kick out the Americans, ahlan wa sahlan. But otherwise, I'm just not interested. So it's a very tight spot for the Syrian Kurds because on the one hand, the regime no longer feels, in the least bit impelled to negotiate with them. Assad feels he's won. At the same time, of course, the world's attention is no longer focused on the Kurds. The war against Islamic State, okay, they still exist in some shape and form. They, have these cells, etc., and every now and then they'll mount an attack, but they're really not, anywhere close to being the threat they used to pose. And the world's attention is focused on Gaza and on Ukraine. And the level of US engagement, for all the rhetoric about we're here, we're staying, we're not leaving, etc., it's quite clear, the engagement is just not there. Some of the Syrian Kurdish leadership was meant to travel to the United States earlier this year and was sort of suddenly told that they'd been disinvited. And the reason being, of course, that the United States does not want to provoke Turkey, especially at a time when they're hoping that Turkey will deliver a Swedish membership of NATO, which it still hasn't. It's still using that as a bargaining chip. At the same time, the Russians, of course, because of the war in Ukraine, also don't want to antagonize the Turks. And things have changed between the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, which were more engaged, particularly the UAE with the SDF, also have improved their relationship with Turkey. So that's also changed. And then, of course, as Fabrice mentioned, the Arab tribes have now, beginning to sort of rise up. They've sort of put a Band-Aid over that for now, but the potential for that kind of unrest reoccurring is very much there. So given all this adversity and with Iran now attacking them, because in my interview with Mazloum, he said that the Iranian proxies were not just targeting the American installations, they were going after the SDF, and that's new. That's a new and dangerous development, just as Turkey continues to attack relentlessly civilian infrastructure. Fabrice saw that for himself, as did I, oil installations, power plants, and of course, all the drone strikes, which, don't just go after alleged PKK militants, they also kill civilians. So, and then the drought, of course, climate change, there are entire villages that have now been depopulated. And as I traveled through, Raqqa and onto, around the Deir ez-Zor area, it was so evident to me, having been there in the past, how much it's changed. Entire streams, sort of tributaries of the rivers have dried up. So they're not in a good place.
Fabrice, a question for you. How has the Arab normalization process with Syria, you and both Amberin mentioned this earlier, affected Assad's position? Has it contributed to greater stabilization, his greater sense of not being pressured? How do you see that process playing out?
The Arab normalization process is frozen. Does it mean, okay, in May you had this meeting in Jeddah, the Arab League, and Assad has been invited and rehabilitated to the Arab League. Assad was expected financial support from Saudi Arabia, from the Arab countries, but there is nothing, because Assad won too much. He tell that it's Saudi, it's Qatar who paid to destroy Syria because they supported the Syrian opposition. And so now Saudi and Qatar have to pay to rebuild Syria. So his expectations are a little bit too much. And there is no way that Mohammed bin Salman or the Prince of Qatar will pay. Qatar is still opposed to the rehabilitation. He hasn't voted against, but he was not present when Assad came back to Jeddah. So the Syrian people are very disappointed because they thought that it was they are going to see the light after 12 years of war. But there is nothing. You have the problem of the refugees, you have the problem of the drug, because the Saudis told to Assad that you have to stop to produce drug and to send the drug to our country. Assad told, okay, but give me money and I will stop, because it's about $10 billion per year, the production of drug in Syria. So he wants at least this 10 million, but of course the Gulf has no guarantee that Assad will stop. And the refugees, Jordan, but they asked for the refugees come back to Syria, but we have to understand that Assad don't want that the refugees come back. First, it's Arab Sunni population, and his goal is to reduce this Arab Sunni population to keep the power, and also it belongs to the Iranian plan of Shia crescent in the area to also reduce the Sunni population in favor of the Shia population. And also Assad, how Assad reinforce his social base by giving the land and the houses of the refugees who are outside to the people who are still in Syria, who have been loyal to the regime. And like that, he is rebuilding his social base, is rebuilding the loyalty of the people who are in Syria by distributing land and house to them. So even if Assad declared, okay, the refugees are welcome, they can come back, I give an amnesty, at the local level, the Syrians don't want that the refugees come back.
We're just about out of time, but we have one question. I'm going to give this one to Amberin. I know you weren't in Turkey, but there was a question about Erdogan's position on the Israel-Hamas war. How is he playing the war, and is this an advantage to him or not? If you could help us understand how he sees the war and how he's trying to take advantage of it.
Well, I mean, I think at a personal level, his sympathies are have always been very clearly with the Palestinians. I mean, he comes from the Turkey's Islamist movement, which, you know, if you read the literature, it's openly hostile to Israel. There's quite a bit of anti-Semitism there, and the man that he describes as his inspiration, this Turkish sort of writer, ideologue, he's openly anti-Semitic, and I mean, just setting all of that aside, is he trying to take advantage? Very obviously trying to take advantage, because he's playing to the his domestic audience on the one hand, with an eye on the local elections that are coming up in March, and at the same time, of course, to the Arab street, where, you know, he actually, I remember very vividly when I was in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the Arab Quarter, and also in the sort of the West Bank. There's tremendous sympathy for Erdogan. You see his picture on the walls of, you know, kebab shops and stuff like that. People's sort of keychains have his picture on it. There's so much back and forth between Gaza and the West Bank and Turkey. A lot of travel. So yeah, he's using that to burnish his credentials on the Arab street at the same time. But then we also know, and this was, I think, Fehim Tashtikin wrote a piece for us about that, the commerce, the trade between Turkey and Israel is continuing apace. And we also know that even his son, his older son, who owns several ships, commercial vessels, has been, even as he was railing against Israel, been carrying goods back and forth from Israel. This was documented, all based on open source information. And the name of the ideologue that I suddenly couldn't remember, by the way, that he says is his big hero, is Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. To those who follow Turkey closely, that name will be familiar. So yeah, that's kind of his play here, and it's kind of so far been cost-free for him. I mean, the sort of press conference he had with Olaf Scholz in Germany, where he basically mocked the Germans, saying, you know, oh, your position stems wholly from this complex, this huge guilt complex you have because of your Nazi past. That's why you're so pro-Israeli, you know, saying that just, you know, before the cameras, and he gets away with it. You know, it does him no harm. So far he's faced no censure for it. He you know, the brinksmanship aspect is in full play here, evidence, and nobody seems to be pushing back, though there is, of course, some concern in Washington that was relayed to his government about Hamas, the presence of Hamas people sanctioned by the US on Turkish soil, and their finances, of course. But then there's this huge, you know, contradiction there, because on the one hand, Qatar also has those relations with Hamas, yet is being continually lauded for its role in mediating these hostage deals, etc. So the lack of consistency of the West, the double standards, as they say, that, you know, on the one hand, when Russia attacks Ukraine, you talk about human rights, etc., and when Israel does the same thing to the Palestinians, you don't say anything. All of these things play to his advantage. You know, he's using it to the max.
And one quick follow-up question, because we're out of time, but you raised an interesting point. Why, unlike Qatar, didn't Erdogan use his position to engage or negotiate to get international credit to show that he could play a role, like he has tried with Russia and Ukraine?
It's not that he didn't, it's that he couldn't. He very much wanted to, as I understand. But, at the end of the day, Turkey's not an Arab country, number one. I apologize for that noise. And number two, I think you have to have some credibility also with both of the interlocutors. And I think Turkey's credibility now with Israel is zero. And so for now, however much we say there have been no consequences, I think in the medium to long term, of course, there are consequences. And I think that however much he's trying to play this clever game of sort of saying this is all about Netanyahu, he's the big monster here, if it weren't for him, Israel would be acting differently. Well, no. And if any leader was running Israel and that happened to them, that Hamas attacked in that way, I have not the slightest doubt that the reaction would be the same from the Israeli government, because for them, whether we understand it or not, whether we criticize it or not, it's existential. And so, if you're Israeli or you're, Jewish, and you're looking at how Erdogan has been, handling this, you may think that this relationship is unrecoverable, though, of course, at the end of the day, Turkey is an extremely important country, but in the same way that Netanyahu won't be around forever, nor will Erdogan. And so with bearing that in mind, of course, both countries are not taking this, trying not to break off the relationship altogether. But I do still believe that words do matter, and that this has done harm to Israeli-Turkish relations for sure.
We are out of time, in fact, over time, but this was a just fantastic conversation. I want to thank you both, Amberin Zaman, Chief Correspondent for Al Monitor, Fabrice Balanche, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Adjunct Fellow, and other distinguished affiliations as well, two of the best on these topics. Thank you. Thanks also to our viewers and subscribers. And look forward to rejoining again next week.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Phil.